Hi, Fabio from Hopsworks here, and today we're going to be taking a look at external feature groups in Hopsworks, what they are, how to use them, and when they're actually useful. What external feature groups are feature groups that are registered in Hopsworks, but the data is not stored in Hopsworks itself, but it's already stored on some external storage systems. That could be a cloud data warehouse like Snowflake, BigQuery on Redshift, but it can also be a data lake like S3 or an object store like S3, GCS and ADLS, depending on which cloud you're using. So there are a couple of different use cases for Hopsworks external feature groups. The main one being you already have existing pipelines that are running and that are producing features, for instance, and they're writing them on a Snowflake table, for instance, right? So you want to register those features with Hopsworks so that data scientists have a unified platform to be able to access all these features, no matter if they're coming, as I said, from a Snowflake table, or maybe they're coming from a feature pipeline using streaming and Spark streaming and so on, like we've seen in other videos. And you can join them together with a single unified API and interface and so on. So that's the main use case. Today we're going to be looking at kind of a couple of different ones and looking at how you can actually implement them using the Hopsworks API. We're going to do that using Snowflake as a backend storage, but the same concept can be applied on the different cloud providers, data warehouses, and data lakes, for which Hopsworks has support for through the connectors. Right, so the first thing we have to do is set up a connector for Snowflake on Hopsworks. So if I can go into my project, I can see that I've already done that. I already set up this Snowflake connector. Here there are a couple of parameters that you need to define. The main one being the connection URL and the authentication. Right, here I suggest you use a service account. The reason for that being that the storage connector is being shared among all the members of a specific project. So everybody can use that storage connector to be able to create external feature groups and to be able to read data from those external feature groups. So it's not tied to a specific user, but rather to a specific project. So service accounts are more easily, a more suited approach in this specific use case. The other parameters you need to set is the warehouse. When we create an external feature group, as I said, the data is not in Hopsworks, but rather on the external system. In this case is on Snowflake. So when you actually need to access that specific feature, what's going to happen is that Hopsworks is going to send a query to Snowflake to be able to actually compute that feature and retrieve that feature value, essentially. For Snowflake to be able to execute a query, you need to provide the warehouse on which a query is going to execute. So what we are doing here is that we are saying to Hopsworks, use this compute warehouse as a warehouse to execute the query. And then we need to provide the database name and the schema to be able to identify which tables on Snowflake we're going to use to build our own external feature groups. After that, we can do a quick check on the connector configuration just to make sure that everything is configured correctly, is successful, so we can go ahead and start creating our external feature groups. Right. So the first thing we do, and the first example, it's a quite simple example. We already have a pipeline running somewhere. Maybe it's a dbt model, maybe it's some Snowpipe or something like this, writing data into a Snowflake table, and we just want to register the entire table as feature group in Hopsworks, right? So the first thing we do, as always, import the Hopsworks library, connect to the Hopsworks feature store, and then here we need to retrieve the connector information to be able to actually connect to Snowflake, right? Second thing we need to do is to specify the query that we want to execute. As I said, in this case, we want to read the entire transaction table as features in Hopsworks. And so I'm doing basically a select statement, a select star from Hopsworks as a query statement. Then I can go ahead and create my feature group. Creating an external feature group is really similar to creating any other feature group. You need to provide the name, the version. You can provide the primary key information. You can provide the statistic configurations and so on. There are two differences here. That we need to provide the storage connector information. So telling Hopsworks, okay, when you need to read data from this specific feature group, these are the credentials you need to use. These are the connector you need to use. And the second thing you need to provide is the query information, right? So this how do you build the actual feature group and how do you retrieve the data from Snowflake, right? So in this case, as I said, select everything from transaction table. And finally, we call save method. say we're actually going to register the feature group in Hopsworks. So I can go in my feature groups, and I can look at the Snowflake plain feature group, and you can see that I have all my columns on Snowflake being registered as features in Hopsworks to be able to actually build models and so on. So this is the first simple use case. You're not limited to just select everything from a table. You can actually express feature engineering as SQL when registering an external feature group. That's the second use case. You just have data on a data warehouse, and you want to do feature engineering using SQL. That's a way you can actually do it with Hopsworks, right? You can express this. In this case, in this example, we're looking at, for instance, creating a feature called average transaction amount for a specific credit card on a specific category. So we are expressing this information as a SQL statement, which we are then registering with Hopsworks through the creation of an external feature group, right? So as always, we specify the storage connector, we specify the query. Here we're specifying the composite primary key because we have two columns forming the primary key. And then we're also specifying the event time, as the average obviously changes over time. Finally, we also want these features to be available online because this is a real-time use case. And I'm going to cover what does that mean for an external feature group to be available online in a second. And then, yeah, I can just call save, and this will basically create my feature group in Snowflake as well, right? So I can actually go here and have a quick look at it. You can see that I have to register my composite primary key, the event time, and my feature that I created. Okay, what does it mean for an external feature group to be available online? So in this case, we're using Snowflake as a backend storage for our feature data, and Snowflake is really good for doing batch retrieval of data. So for instance, for either training models or doing batch inference. But Snowflake cannot provide the latency requirements, latency requirements for doing real-time inference. So you cannot retrieve data from Snowflake with a low enough latency for powering these real-time models, right? So this is where Hopsworks can be useful. Is Hopsworks provides the technology to be able to do real-time inference. And so what we want to do is basically we want to make sure that we cache on the online feature store the most recent values for each credit card and category, so that they are available for models to be able to retrieve that information and make inference essentially. So that's what we do here. The way you actually build this pipeline is quite straightforward. You retrieve the external feature group, and what you actually need to do is basically call the insert method on the external feature group, right? The insert method works across different type of feature groups. On the external feature group, it's a little bit different in the sense of only writes data on the online feature store. It doesn't write data in the offline one, as the offline is actually the Snowflake table we are reading data from, right? So how do we actually read the data? In this case, we're doing a simple read operation on the entire data frame and upload everything on the online feature store. But you can actually apply different filters. You can actually make this query a little bit more complex depending on the use case, depending on, for instance, on how often you run the pipelines, and so on and so forth, right? So you can take this code and run it as a job in Hopsworks and schedule it every day, every hour, or something like this. And you basically refreshing the data on the online feature store so that the models can have always access to the most recent values of the feature values, essentially. This is the second use case. So you're using Snowflake to be able to train the data, and you're also using the Hopsworks feature store to be able to power the real-time models. There's an additional use case for external feature groups that is quite interesting as well. So in this case, we are computing the feature value. Let me just quickly go back here. Every time we run this query, the value is going to be different, right? So that's why we also provide this. We also compute this event time because obviously, as new transactions come in, new values are going to get produced, right? So what you want to do when you're building a model is actually rely on the history of that feature over the course of time, right? You can store the history in Snowflake itself, and then you can go back to this specific point where you're basically selecting everything, and the table itself contains the history. But you can also use Hopsworks feature store to build out the history over time, right? So what basically is going to happen is that you can keep executing the same query that we are looking at here, the same average transaction amount every hour, every 10 minutes, or something like this, and write the output of this query into a feature group in Hopsworks. And so over time, what's going to happen is that as the query gets executed over and over and over, and the output gets built up in Hopsworks as a feature group, and so you're basically building up the history. So you can see here what's happening. You can basically look at this specific example. We are retrieving the feature group. This is the feature group that executes the query on Snowflake. We are reading up the values of that query at that moment in time. I can update my cache feature group so that the history gets built up essentially, right? So I actually have this example as a job. I can quickly have a look at it. You can see that now it's running already. I can see that it has been running every 10 minutes for some time now. And so I'm basically building up the history to train my model on my historical data. And we're going to be looking at another video how to do backfilling of that same feature data as well. These are the different use cases for which you want to use external feature groups. Thank you for listening, and we're going to be seeing each other in another video.